Set back. Let your thoughts grow quiet. The night outside is cold, the fields empty, and only the wind moves through the trees. In the Middle Ages, fear ruled stronger than faith, and superstition clung to every shadow. Tonight, we step into that world, a world where a candle flicker, a strange dream, or even the wrong word could mark you forever. A world where to be called a witch was to stand already at the edge of the fire. Reason 1 teen, you knew too much about herbs. The night is damp, the fire barely alive in the hearth. You reach for a bundle of dried plants tied with string, yarrow, sage, perhaps a sprig of wormwood. For you, it's nothing more than common sense. A tea to settle the stomach, a poultice to draw infection from a wound. But in the eyes of your neighbors, knowledge like this carries a shadow. In the Middle Ages, medicine was often a matter of prayer, relics, or bloodletting at the hands of a barber, surgeon who smelled more of owl than antiseptic. Yet here you are, pulling fevers down with willow bark and calming coughs with thyme. Too effective, perhaps. Too different. The whispers start small. She healed a child when the priest's blessing failed. Then they grow louder. She must have help from darker powers. You don't own books. They're too rare, too precious. But people don't believe you could have such knowledge without secret texts, without charms whispered by spirits in the forest. When little else collapses in the square with a fever, you are the one who brings her back from death's door. And instead of gratitude, there are wary glances, muttered prayers, and fingers crossed behind backs. For in a world where ignorance is safer than wisdom, healing with herbs does not make you a helper. It makes you suspicious. It makes you dangerous. It makes you, by their standards, a witch. Reason to say, you were a woman who lived alone. The cottage stands on the edge of the village, its thatched roof sagging under years of rain. Smoke curls lazily from the chimney, but there is no man at the door, no husband, to plow the fields or bring in firewood. Only you. In the Middle Ages, a woman alone was an anomaly, an interruption in the rhythm of society. You were supposed to belong to someone, father, husband, son. But if you lived alone, if you tended your own garden, if you sold eggs at the market without a man at your side, the questions began. Why does she live alone? Why does she not remarry? Whose company does she keep at night? Children run past your door, daring each other to shout insults and then scatter, laughing. Old men spit when they see you, muttering that no good can come of a woman who refuses her place. And then comes the real danger, when the harvest fails, when a cow gives sour milk, when a baby dies in the cradle. The village needs someone to blame, and you, alone, different, defenseless, fit the role perfectly. So they say you're seen walking by moonlight. They whisper of shadows in your windows. They claim you speak with the devil himself. Not because of what you've done, but because you dared to live without the protection or the control of a man. In the eyes of medieval Europe, that independence was not strength. It was sorcery. Reason 3, your neighbors envied you. It doesn't take much to spark envy in a world where survival hangs by a thread. Perhaps your garden grows greener than theirs. Perhaps your chickens lay more eggs, or your loom weaves tighter cloth. Perhaps your face, though lined with age, still carries a trace of beauty, or your hair shines when others grows dull with malnutrition. That's enough. Envy is fertile soil for suspicion. If your neighbor's cow dries up while yours swells with milk, it's not luck. It's witchcraft. If their child grows sick while yours thrives, it must be your doing. The rumors grow like mold in damp timber. Someone swears they saw you whispering into the well. Another claims you plucked hairs from their horse's mane by candlelight. And suddenly, when the magistrate comes knocking, the evidence has already been written in the minds of the villagers. Your good fortune, small as it may be, is no blessing. It's a curse. Not upon you, but upon everyone around you. In the Middle Ages, envy didn't just rot friendships. It killed. It placed you in the stocks, or worse, at the end of a rope, because nothing was more dangerous than being just a little too lucky, just a little too blessed, just a little too envied. Reason 4 say, you had an animal companion. The cat curls by your feet, eyes glowing like embers in the firelight. To you, it is a companion, a mouser, a scrap of warmth against the cold. But to your neighbors, it is something far darker. In the Middle Ages, animals, especially cats, toads, crows, and black dogs, were not simply creatures. They were believed to be familiars, demons in disguise, spirits who whispered in your ear and carried out your commands. So when a rooster crows at midnight near your house, it's not a trick of nature. It's a sign that you keep the devil's company. When your cat slips into the shadows and someone's child wakes screaming from a nightmare, the connection is drawn immediately. Your pet has been stealing their breath. They will watch you with narrowed eyes as you scatter grain for your hens. They will mutter prayers when your dog follows too closely at your heels. And when the priest preaches of women who consort with beasts, every head turns slowly in your direction. What you see as love, they see as pact. What you see as companionship, they see as conspiracy. And when the bailiff knocks at your door, they won't come for you alone. They'll come for the animal, too, for the rope is as ready for a cat as it is for a woman. Reason 5 EU spoke out of turn. The hall is filled with smoke, the air thick with the smell of meat roasting on the spit. The men sit at the long table, tankards in hand, their voices loud, their laughter louder. You sit near the fire, spinning wool, listening. And then, perhaps without meaning to, you speak. It could be something small, a correction, a jest, an opinion. But your voice cuts through the noise like a blade. The laughter stills. The men turn, their eyes narrowing. In a society where silence was a woman's virtue, your words become weapons against you. She speaks too boldly, they mutter. She challenges men. And from there, the path is short. She must be filled with pride. She must be unnatural. She must be wicked. The words were dangerous in the Middle Ages, especially when they came from the wrong mouth. A woman who spoke too freely was not simply rude. She was threatening. If her tongue could shame a man, what else could it do? Could it curse a harvest? Could it call the storm? Could it blight a newborn child? It doesn't matter if your words are kind, or clever, or true. The very act of speaking makes you dangerous. And so, when a quarrel breaks out in the village, and someone swears they heard you muttering under your breath, the memory of your sharp words will rise again like smoke. In a world where silence was safety, speaking was sorcery. Reason 6C, you dream too vividly. The dreams come heavy at night. You wake with the taste of ashes on your tongue, the sound of wings in your ears. Sometimes you dream of fire, sometimes of water, sometimes of faces that are not your own. You tell no one, of course. But dreams have a way of slipping into the open. Maybe you mutter in your sleep. Maybe you share one dream with a neighbor, thinking it harmless. I saw the miller's cow give birth. And then, a week later, the cow births a calf exactly as you described. That is enough. Prophecy, even unintentional, was no gift in the Middle Ages. It was terror. If you saw what others could not, it was not God speaking to you. It was the devil. If your dreams came true, you must be in league with something unnatural. And when misfortune struck, when a storm flattened the barley, when a baby was born sickly, the villagers would whisper, "She dreamed it first." There is no defense. For how do you argue with what sleeps inside your own mind? In time, you stop speaking of your dreams. You bury them deep, but still, when your eyes linger too long, when your lips move as if speaking silently, the thought creeps into every heart around you, "This woman knows too much of what should remain hidden." And so the dreamer, too, is marked, not blessed, not cursed, but condemned. Reason 70, you knew the herbs too well, the hedgerows are your allies. You know which leaves will cool a fever, which roots will still a child's cough, which flowers can ease the ache of childbirth. You do not think of it as power. It is survival. Knowledge passed down in whispers, in the hands of mothers, grandmothers, midwives. But knowledge itself is dangerous. When the villagers fall ill, they come to you before the priest. And when your teas and poultices work better than his Latin prayers, resentment blooms like mold on bread. Healing is not a gift in their eyes, it is a theft. For you step into the role of God, deciding who lives and who suffers. It takes only one mistake. One child who does not wake, one fever that will not break, one wound that festers despite your salves. And suddenly your hands, once praised for their skill, are accused of corruption. They say she keeps dried foxglove under her bed, whispers a neighbor, that she feeds henbane to her enemies. The irony is cruel. You heal them, and so they call you witch. You fail them, and so they call you witch. There is no escape from the circle. When the church bell tolls for another funeral, you feel eyes turn to you. The herbs in your satchel grow heavy, like stones dragging you toward the river. And you know that one day soon they will burn not your herbs, but you. Reason 8. You were too independent. The thatch on your cottage roof is patched by your own hand. The fields are tilled by your own strength. You fetch water, chop wood, mend clothes, all without husband or master. To modern eyes, it is resilience. To medieval ones, it is rebellion. A woman alone is never truly alone in the Middle Ages. She is surrounded by suspicion. If you do not remarry, why not? If you manage your own land, where does the money come from? If you have no man to provide for you, who protects you from sin? The answer, for them, is simple: you must be protected by something darker, something unholy. Widows were particularly vulnerable, too poor to bribe their way free, too visible to go unnoticed, too accustomed to independence to bow their heads low, and every act of self-sufficiency, selling milk, hiring labor, speaking directly in court, was another nail in the coffin of suspicion. The village might whisper, "She doesn't need a husband." But underneath, the thought curdles, "She must have another master." And in their eyes, there was only one other master. So the widow, the spinster, the woman with no man at her side, she was marked, not as free, but as damned. Reason 99, your misfortune became theirs one winter. Your cow sickens. You lose your crop to frost. Your roof caves beneath the snow. Misfortune follows you like a shadow. And because misery is never born alone, in the Middle Ages, your neighbors soon feel it too. The baker's bread fails to rise. The blacksmith's child takes ill. The priest stumbles on his sermon, and suddenly the connections thread themselves together like a spider's web. Your cow dies, and so does theirs. Your field floods, and so does theirs. Your bad luck infects the village like plague. It doesn't matter that misfortune is common, that disease spreads blindly, that storms care nothing for boundaries. In their eyes, you are the source. A witch's curse seeps outward like smoke, staining everyone it touches. And once the idea takes hold, every glance becomes proof. When you walk past the well, and the rope breaks in someone's hand, they will say you caused it. When you stand near the hearth and the fire sputters, they will say you willed it. When a man dreams of your face, they will say you visited him in the night. In truth, you are no more cursed than they are. But in a world desperate for reasons, desperate for blame, your suffering becomes their salvation. Better one witch than a world without order, better you condemn than them exposed to chaos. And so your misfortune becomes your crime. Reason Tunande, you were simply in the wrong place sometimes. There is no reason at all. No cat, no herbs, no sharp tongue or strange dream. Sometimes it is as simple as being the wrong woman, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. A child dies suddenly, and the grieving parents must name a cause. A storm wrecks the harvest, and the Lord must soothe his tenant's rage. A plague spreads, and the priest must remind the people that evil still stalks the earth. And so they point to you. Perhaps because you were nearby, perhaps because you are poor, perhaps because you are simply expendable. It begins with whispers, then questions, then the slow, inevitable tightening of the noose. You are brought before the court, where men who barely know your name weigh your soul on scales already tipped against you. And when the verdict comes, when they call you witch, it will not matter what you say. For the word itself is heavier than truth. The torch will be lit. The crowd will gather. And you will burn not for what you did, not for what you believed, but for what they needed you to be. And so the dreamer, too, is marked. Not blessed, not cursed, but condemned, and in the villages, towns, and stone-walled cities of the Middle Ages, that condemnation carried weight sharper than any sword. For it was not enough to accuse. The accusation had to be proven. And proof, in those centuries, did not mean evidence. It meant spectacle. The ordeal of proof. You stand before the church door, the crowd pressing in behind you. The priest's voice drones, but his words are not meant for you. They are meant for them. He speaks of devils, of temptation, of the frailty of women's flesh. He reminds them that God's enemies walk disguised among them. And as he speaks, their faces shift from curiosity to certainty. Your name is already decided, your fate already sealed. But still, they will test you. The river waits, its surface dark and rippling. You are bound, arms twisted behind your back, a rope cutting into your wrists. They say that water is pure, that it will reject all that is unholy. If you float, you are guilty. If you sink, you are innocent, but drowned. There is no victory in this, only survival, and even that is brief. Others face fire, the ordeal of the iron, a red, hot bar placed in their hands, forced to walk 3 steps before letting it drop. The burns are bound and sealed, and if after 3 days the wounds fester, the verdict is clear witch. Still others are pressed, stones piled on their chests until their ribs crack like old branches. And each time the weight is added, the crowd leans forward, listening for confession. But there is no confession, only the silence of lungs collapsing under the strain. These are not trials, they are rituals. Not of justice, but of theater. Each flame, each rope, each stone is an offering to the hunger of fear. And it is fear, more than faith, that feeds the crowd. The machinery of fear, the medieval world, was built on insecurity. Plague came without warning, war without reason, famine without mercy. To live in the Middle Ages, was to walk each day on the edge of collapse. And in such a world, answers mattered more than truth. The priest could not stop the rats that carried the Black Death. The Lord could not stop the rain that rotted the harvest. The king could not stop the armies that marched across the fields. But a witch could be burned. She could be pointed at, dragged from her home, made to kneel in the dirt and confess to things she had never done. She could be made into the reason, into the explanation, for everything no man could control. And so she became a tool. Witch hunts were not accidents of ignorance. They were instruments of order. Each body burned reminded the people that authority still held sway, that the church was watching, that the Lord was strong. That chaos had a face, and it was not theirs. The fire, when the sentence comes, it comes swiftly. You are led to the square, rope biting into your wrists, your feet bare against the cobblestones. The pyre has already been built. Dry wood stacked high, pitch poured thick, the air heavy with the smell of oil. The crowd waits, some eager, some silent. Children perched on their father's shoulders, faces wide. Women clutching their rosaries, lips moving in silent prayer. And you are bound to the stake, the rope scraping your skin. The priest offers you one last chance to confess, to name others, to admit the devil's mark on your soul. But the words stick in your throat, heavy as lead. When the torch touches the wood, the fire climbs greedily, licking, then devouring. The heat sears your lungs before it touches your skin. Smoke blinds your eyes before the flames do. And somewhere, in the roar of fire and the cries of the crowd, you realize the truth. It was never about you. It was never about your herbs, or your cat, or your sharp tongue, or your dreams. It was about them, their fears, their hunger for order in a world that made no sense. You are the sacrifice, the offering to certainty. And when the flames finally silence you, the people feel safer. Not because the world has changed, but because for one fleeting moment, they believe it has. The legacy of the witch, centuries will pass. The fires will fade. The gallows will rot. And still the word will remain witch. It will travel across oceans, whispered in new tongues, reshaped by new fears. It will appear in books, in stories told by candlelight, in the frightened warnings of mothers to their children. And though the world will change, though science will explain what once seemed unholy, though reason will chip away at superstition, the shadow of those flames will linger. Even now, the word carries weight, sometimes playful, sometimes cruel, sometimes proud, but always heavy. For to be called a witch was never truly about magic. It was about difference, about power in the wrong hands, about being inconvenient to those who craved control, and that truth does not vanish with time. So if you wonder why you would not last a day in the Middle Ages, it is not because of plague, or famine, or war, though all of those would claim you quickly enough. It is because of this, the moment you stood out, the moment you spoke too loud, lived too freely, dreamed too boldly, the moment you reminded them that the world was fragile, and that their control over it was an illusion. That moment was enough to name you, enough to condemn you, enough to see you burn, enough to name you, enough to condemn you, enough to see you burn. But the fire was never the end. For when the flames died down and the ash scattered into the wind, something lingered. The fear remained, like smoke clinging to the rafters of a house long after the blaze, and the name, witch, did not vanish with the body. It traveled, whispered from mouth to mouth, sewn into songs, etched into sermons. The villagers would return to their homes that night, warmed by the fire not just of the pyre, but of the illusion that they had done something righteous. The Lord would smile, for order had been restored. The priest would pray louder, for his voice now carried authority. And the children, the children would remember. They would remember the screams, the smell of pitch, the way the fire painted the sky, and in their memory, the idea of witchcraft grew stronger, not weaker. The witch was gone. But the witch would live on. The scapegoat for every ill fortune. Another name could be chosen. A child fell ill. A witch had cursed the milk. The crops rotted. A witch had sowed the rain. The soldiers lost the battle. A witch had whispered to the enemy. It was simple. Too simple. And yet it worked. In a world where famine and plague swept through villages like wolves in the night, people demanded explanations. And when explanations did not come, they created them. To survive in such a world was to keep your head low, your words softer than the wind, your habits hidden. Because at any moment, the whisper could turn, and it would be you standing in the square, your name carried on the tongues of neighbors who once smiled at you. And you would realize then that it was not truly belief that condemned you. It was convenience. You were not burned because they feared you. You were burned because you were useful to their fear. The gender of fear, most often, it was women. Widows, midwives, healers, the poor, the strange. Those without the shield of a husband's name, those who carried knowledge of roots and herbs, those who lived a little too far from the village square. But men, too, were not safe. The scholar whose books wandered too close to forbidden questions. The hermit whose silence unsettled. The rival whose land was coveted. The net was wide, and it did not discriminate when fear outweighed reason. But still, the burden fell heaviest on women, because the Middle Ages had already written their weakness into scripture. Eve had bitten the fruit. Eve had whispered with the serpent. And so every woman carried, in the eyes of the church, a shadow of guilt before she even spoke. To be born female was to be one step closer to the fire. The silence after, when the smoke cleared, silence was the loudest sound. Families learned quickly not to speak the names of the dead. To question was dangerous. To protest, foolish. So they folded their grief inward, carrying it like a secret bruise. The house stood empty. The herbs withered untended. The fields lay barren without the hands that once tended them. But no one asked. And this silence was the true victory of the pyre. Not the death of one accused, but the submission of all who remained. The fire did not only consume the accused, it consumed the courage of the community. Every burning was a warning. Every gallows a sermon. Every grave without a stone a reminder that in this world, survival meant obedience. The inheritance of fire centuries later, when scholars would look back, they would shake their heads. They would write of superstition, of hysteria, of ignorance. They would say the Middle Ages were dark, and that reason would come with the light of later centuries. But they would be wrong to believe the fire ever truly went out. For the idea remained, lurking in the corners of villages and cities alike. It changed its shape. Sometimes it was called witchcraft, sometimes heresy, sometimes treason. Always it was the same, the hunt for the other, the convenient victim who explained what reason could not. And even in times of so-called progress, the echoes remained. Trials dressed in new robes, but built on the same stage. Accusations made not to seek truth, but to silence. The witch had been burned, but the world never stopped building pyres. The lesson: you would not survive if you walked into that world, into a medieval village, a cathedral town, a muddy field, you would not last a day, not because of the hunger or the plague or the sword, but because of the eyes that would watch you as you walked, the eyes that would notice your strange clothing, your strange tongue, your strange ways, the eyes that would whisper behind shutters and doors. It would not take long, a day, perhaps two. Then the murmur would spread different, strange, dangerous. And in a world that demanded order, that was enough. The rope would tighten. The pyre would rise. And you would feel the truth too late. That survival in the Middle Ages was not about strength. Not about knowledge. Not even about faith. It was about sameness. About vanishing into the crowd. About never being the spark that might be called flame. The echo of the pyre, the flames have long since died, yet the lesson remains. Fear is a hunger that never starves. It only changes its prey. And if you wonder whether you would have been called a witch, the answer is simple yes. Because the word meant nothing and everything. It meant whoever they needed it to mean. And sooner or later, it would mean you. So when you imagine the fire, do not imagine it only in the past. Imagine it here, now, burning not in wood, but in words, not in smoke, but in silence. For the true danger of the witch hunts was never the fire itself. It was the ease with which the crowd believed it was right to light it, and that ease, that hunger, remains. But the ease, that hunger, remains. You think of it as history, an age of ignorance, long past. But history has a way of disguising itself, wearing new masks while keeping the same teeth. The Middle Ages may be gone, but the instinct that birthed the witch hunt, that survives. It survives in suspicion, in gossip, in the comfort of blaming another when the world feels too heavy. And in that instinct, the fire waits, the shape of the accusation. Accusations in the Middle Ages were rarely about sorcery itself. Few truly believed that the widow by the woods could command storms, or that the midwife's herbs held the devil's breath. But the accusation was never meant to be believed. It was meant to be useful. To accuse was to control. It silenced rivals. It seized property. It reinforced power. The word, witch, was a weapon, and like all weapons, it was aimed not where truth pointed, but where advantage demanded. And because the crowd needed to believe they were righteous, the mask of piety was always worn. God wills it, they said. The devil walks among us. But beneath that holy cloth was always the same hand, greedy, fearful, hungry. Fire as theater, a burning was never only a punishment. It was theater. The pyre was built in the square, not the shadows. The crowd was summoned, bells rung, sermons given. Mothers brought their children. Merchants sold bread and ale. It was a spectacle of fear, designed to instruct as much as to destroy. The accused screamed not only for themselves, but for everyone listening. Their agony was a warning. This is what happens when you step beyond the line. And the crowd would cheer, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. Better her than me, they thought. Better her voice than mine. But in cheering, they became accomplices. And so the fire was fed not only by wood, but by cowardice. The quiet survivors for every pyre that blazed. There were hundreds who bent their heads lower, spoke softer, hid deeper. These were the survivors. Not because they were stronger, but because they were silent. The herbalist who buried her knowledge. The widow who remarried to shield herself. The child who remembered their mother's fate, but never dared to speak it aloud. Survival was not about winning. It was about erasing yourself. And here is the truth you will not like. If you were there, you would not be the hero. You would not save the accused. You would not break the wheel or quench the fire. You would survive by silence. Or you would burn. There was no middle ground. The echo of guilt centuries later, when the archives are opened, the ink is still dark. Names, dates, confessions written in tortured hands. But what is missing from those records is the guilt. The neighbors who lied. The priests who preached. The lords who profited. They left no trace of remorse. History remembers the accused, not the accusers. The women labeled witches. The men branded heretics. Their names are written in the margins of trial books. But the men who lit the pyres, their names are carved in stone above cathedrals. And that, perhaps, is the deepest cruelty. The victims were burned, forgotten, erased. The executioners built monuments that still stand. Would you survive? It is easy to imagine yourself in that world, cloaked in the arrogance of hindsight. You tell yourself you would see through the lies, you would resist the crowd, you would shelter the accused. But would you? Think carefully. Think of the silence required to keep your children safe. Think of the hunger gnawing at your stomach when the harvest failed. Think of the priest's words echoing from the pulpit every Sunday, telling you that the devil walked among you. And then think of the eyes of your neighbors, watching, waiting, ready to turn at the first whisper. You would not survive by courage. You would not survive by reason. You would survive by fear, or you would not survive at all. The fire in the mirror, and so the question is not whether the witch hunts could happen again. The question is whether they ever stopped, for the witch was never real. The witch was always an invention, a mask painted on the nearest face, and as long as humanity seeks easy answers, the witch will be reborn. Today, the pyre may not burn in the village square, but the crowd still gathers, online, in whispers, in headlines. The accusation still spreads faster than fire, consuming lives with the same merciless hunger. The tools change. The flames do not. You would not last a day in the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages never truly ended. They simply changed their name. The condemnation enough to name you. Enough to condemn you. Enough to see you burn. That was true then. It is true now. And when the fire comes, whether in wood, in word, or in silence, you will learn the same lesson they did, that survival is never about truth, never about justice, never about faith. It is about the crowd. And the crowd is always hungry. Hungry not for bread, not for truth, but for spectacle. The crowd has always hungered for someone to stand apart, to stumble, to be named. Because once there is a victim, the rest may feel safe. Once there is a fire, all other shadows seem smaller. This hunger is not bound by the century. It does not vanish with parchment or with pyre. It simply wears a different cloak. The weight of a whisper. In the Middle Ages, it began with a whisper. A glance held too long, a loaf of bread baked too dark, a calf born with twisted legs. The smallest things became omens, and the smallest words became death sentences. But a whisper is never small. A whisper is a spark, and sparks, when fed by fear, become flames. Your neighbor does not need proof. They only need suspicion. They do not need certainty. They only need the comfort of saying, "It was her, not me. It was him, not us." And once spoken, the whisper cannot be undone. The trial is already written before the ink touches the page. The machinery of fear, the Middle Ages, perfected this machinery. Priests to sanction it, scribes to record it, lords to profit from it, and crowds to enforce it. It was not chaos, it was order. Every stage of a witch trial was rehearsed, predictable, ritualized. The accusation, the forced confession, the display of contrition, the sentence. Even the burning was choreographed, with sermons, processions, prayers. What you mistake for madness was, in truth, precision. And that is why you would not last a day. Not because of chance, but because of inevitability. You were never meant to escape the system. You were meant to feed it. The illusion of innocence. Do not think innocence would save you. Innocence was irrelevant. The witch was guilty before she was named. Her crime was not sorcery. It was existing at the wrong time, in the wrong way, under the wrong gaze. To be different was to be dangerous. To be outspoken was to be suspect. To be unlucky was to be doomed. And you, modern, rational, skeptical, you would be guilty too, not because you summoned storms or cursed cattle, but because you would not know how to stay small. You would not know how to vanish into the silence. You carry too much pride in your knowledge, too much belief in your individuality. In the Middle Ages, that pride would betray you. It would put the torch in your neighbor's hand. Fire without ashes, the pyres of Europe left behind more than ashes. They left behind lessons. And the most dangerous lesson was this: cruelty works. Fear unifies. Violence silences. Accusation controls. Generations watched the flames and understood. Kings saw how easily a people could be ruled by fear. Priests saw how easily belief could be weaponized. Neighbors saw how quickly suspicion could erase rivals. The fire ended lives, but it also taught survival. Not survival of the accused, survival of the system. And so, the machinery did not vanish. It only shifted targets. The modern pyre. Do not comfort yourself with the illusion that such things are gone. The Middle Ages may feel distant, but the logic of fear remains sharp as ever. Today, the pyre does not burn wood. It burns reputation. It burns livelihood. It burns the fragile barriers you believe protect you from the crowd. The square has become a screen. The crowd has become invisible, but not silent. They gather in millions now, not dozens. Their whispers travel faster than fire. And you, yes you, are just as vulnerable, for the witch was never about magic. The witch was about blame, and blame never sleeps. The mirror of survival. So let us ask again, would you last a day in the Middle Ages? The truth is not flattering. You would not survive by strength. You would not survive by wisdom. You would survive only by silence. And yet, silence is its own kind of death. To bury yourself, to erase your voice, to shrink until you are invisible, that is survival, but not life. And if you refused silence, if you spoke too loudly, too honestly, too differently, then you would feed the fire. There is no heroism in this choice. Only ash. The last word history does not remember the crowd. Their names rot in parish books, forgotten. It does not remember the accusers, whose words blacken parchment but not stone. It remembers the condemned, the women who stood in chains, the men broken on racks, the children marked by suspicion before they were old enough to speak. They survive in memory, not because they were powerful, but because they were destroyed. Their suffering outlived their executioners. Their silence became the loudest testimony of all, and you, imagining yourself in their place, must understand this: you would not have been spared. The Middle Ages did not care for fairness. It did not care for truth. It cared only for the fire, the hunger that remains, and so we return to the crowd, always hungry, always waiting. It is tempting to think of them as monsters, as something alien, something other. But the truth is simpler and darker. The crowd was always made of people like you. People afraid. People desperate. People who chose survival over justice. And so the crowd endures. When you ask whether you would last a day in the Middle Ages, what you are really asking is whether you could stand alone against the hunger of the crowd. And the answer, whispered across centuries, written in ash and silence, is this no. You would not last a day. Not then. Not now. Not ever.